Hello and welcome to the 255th episode of California Dreaming. I want to thank you for waiting a few extra days for this and basically every episode to arrive into your feeds. I just got back from California yesterday and I finished writing this. It was getting kind of lengthy, so I divided it up into two parts. So as soon as I finish writing part 2, I'll get that recorded and uploaded for you as soon as possible. So I'm feeling lazy today to go through all the social media and Patreon stuff, but I do want to say thank you to Lee B, Lori O, Monica, and Diane S for joining Patreon, and also Diane S for doing both Patreon and PayPal because, girl, I do see you. If you would like to join Patreon or make a generous contribution through PayPal, all of those links are in the show notes. So let me just get started with today's story. Everybody's talking about it, and I have things to say too. So without further ado, this is the tale of Alec Murdaugh and the tangled web he wove, part 1. My dreamers, can I just say that no matter how messed up your life is, no matter how many poor life choices that you've made, no matter how many times you wish that you could go back and do it all differently, no matter how uncertain or fearful the future may seem, you step back and you take a look at the dumpster fire that Alec Murdaugh's life has become, and I'm pretty sure you'll feel a little bit better about yourself. And dumpster fire, it doesn't even really quite capture everything that this man's life has become. It's more like a super inferno. And Alec Murdaugh is like this crazy pyromaniac going around and setting fires everywhere he goes. He doesn't even have to do anything. He could just stroll by something and it's guaranteed to spontaneously burst into flames. The lives that this man has single-handedly destroyed is immeasurable. The destruction that this man is responsible for, the wreckage that he's left behind, is just as bad as any hurricane that's ever slammed into the eastern coast of South Carolina. The chaos in his wake is profound. How did he do it? The better question may be, how could he? Consider the area, the state. The poverty rate ranks amongst the highest in the United States in that area. It doesn't take much to set yourself apart from the pack. If you took the Murdaughs as is, well, back then when they were 4, and stuck them, say, in the middle of Manhattan, they would suddenly discover that they were not as elite as they were down in the Low Country. That's pretty much how Alec Murdaugh did what he did for so long and managed to get away with it. That is until that fateful night, February 24th, 2019, when Alec's younger, heavily intoxicated underage son Paul ran the boat that he was speeding straight into a bridge piling. He had 5 friends with him, and one of them, Mallory Beach, perished in the crash. She was discovered 6 days later where her body had floated 5 miles away from the site of the crash. When Paul was taken to the hospital, he immediately called his grandfather and then his father. And they both knew immediately that they needed to go down to that hospital. They needed to take control, create a narrative that would provide Paul and his family the best and most desirable outcome for themselves. They wanted to manipulate witnesses, intimidate hospital staff, and undermine members of law enforcement. Alec even remembered to hang his honorary solicitor's badge out in front of his left pants pocket so everybody would see and think that he's important and official. And that's because for 100 years, nobody dared to challenge a Murdaugh. That is until Paul killed somebody. Looking back at those early morning hours of the crash, Alec wasn't there with his daddy and his little stupid badge to help Paul. Alec Murdaugh has shown us exactly how he felt about Paul. No, he wasn't there to help him. Nope, not a man like Alec. He was there looking out for number one, himself. He was an attorney, and he knew exactly what was going to happen. This was his boat. He was the one who allowed Paul to run around in it. He knew that his son was a heavy drinker. He was the one who was going to have to cough up the millions of dollars that the families of the other 5 people who were on that boat that night were going to sue him for. He knew that he was about to be pummeled with an onslaught of lawsuits. He wasn't there to protect Paul. Alec Murdaugh was there at the hospital that night to protect his wallet. And when Alec Murdaugh couldn't pull an Alec Murdaugh any longer, 2 years after this crash, he decided to get rid of the problem by blowing the brains out the back of his own son's head, just as he was working on taking a video of his friend's injured dog. This man did that. Alec Murdaugh blasted his son with a shotgun. Paul probably saw him. He saw his father standing there with the shotgun pointed right at him. I mean, let that sink in. Alec could have been standing there with him for a while holding a shotgun, and Paul would not have even thought for a moment that his father would do what he did. All Alec had in his mind was that he needed to get rid of his problems, and he did so by sacrificing his own child, and then he shot his child's mother, who probably also saw Alec coming towards her too. Alec Murdaugh sacrificed Paul to save his own ass, when he should have done the right thing and blown his own brains out. Not advocating self-harm, I know Paul was an abusive, spoiled, entitled, tantrumy man-baby, but he did not deserve this. There are so many other things Alec could have done instead of that, including taking his own life, if he was really looking to get out of his growing legal and financial problems. I feel bad for both Maggie and Paul. In the last seconds of their lives, they know who did this to them. They had that split second of terror as Alec took aim and fired. Back in January of 2022, when I first covered this story for you, I don't remember having an overwhelming feeling that Alec did it. I just didn't see a strong motive for this man to do something like this. Even now that this case is closed and the conviction has been had, I'm still having a little bit of a hard time with the motive that was given behind Alec so heartlessly murdering his son and wife. I really don't see how this man thought that that was the solution. If he murdered them to make his problems go away, how? How was that supposed to work? Was it a distraction? Was there life insurance? Maybe Alec blamed Paul for getting them into this mess in the first place. But you know, that's just as much Alec's fault as it was Paul's. I mean, for Paul, and I said in the Facebook group, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but that guy was a pretty terrible person. Like I said, he was entitled, spoiled, rotten to the core, violent, abusive, and his blood alcohol content was 0.24. That's really high, even for the best of us. But get that BAC into a teenager, as I've described him, and you've got a time bomb waiting to explode. Paul reminded me of Affluenza Kid over in Texas. Remember him? Ethan Couch? Another ginger over there in the lovely state of Texas. He too had a blood alcohol content of 0.24 the night that we all got to know his name. And he acted like a little asshole to his friends too, driving all fast and crazy, and ended up killing 4 people when he crashed into a broken down vehicle. And if you've never heard of this little spoiled brat over in Texas, well, he's now a grown-up spoiled brat, I'm sure. It's going to be 10 years this June since Ethan Couch crashed his truck and killed those 4 people and injured 9 others. If you were watching HLN back then, you know that Nancy Grace was all over this kid and she had a field day with him. Ethan Couch is 27 years old now. This accident happened back in June of 2013 in Burleson, Texas. And just like in the story that we're talking about today, you know darn well that the rotten apple doesn't fall far from the rotten tree. Ethan's parents really didn't do much at all in the way of parenting, if I remember correctly. Even though his mom and dad were a couple of screw-ups themselves, they had money. Ethan's father owned a multi-million-dollar sheet metal business, and Ethan lived in a mansion by himself that his dad owned also. And his dad left him with a pickup truck to drive. Ethan was 16 years old at the time of the crash, but he started driving himself to private school when he was only 13. And when the principal called up the parents and were like, your kid absolutely cannot be driving himself to school like this. I mean, can you imagine being in middle school and seeing your buddy drive up and park next to the math teacher? His parents ended up pulling him out of the private school because of the principal's complaint, and he attended a co-op until he was 15, and then he just went and enrolled in community college after that. Living alone in this house that his dad owned, of course, left Ethan to his own devices. He drank and did drugs and basically invited anyone who wanted to come over to party with him, even if he didn't know them, whether he knew these people or not. He had like this open door policy, so it's easy to see how all of this turned into him crashing his truck, which was a Ford F-350, traveling 70 miles per hour or 112 kilometers per hour, and driving it right into a vehicle that was pulled off the side of the road. It was a tragedy just waiting to happen. But what ended up outraging everybody was the fact that Ethan Couch got a slap on the wrist for what he had done. 4 lives lost, 9 others injured. 1 was paralyzed. The 4 who were killed were standing next to the parked vehicle. 2 of them lived at the house that this vehicle broke down in front of, and they had come out to see if they could help. They all died on impact. Nobody in Ethan's truck had a seatbelt on. When the crash happened, his vehicle rolled and everyone was ejected. One of his passengers was in a coma following the crash and was left paralyzed, requiring around-the-clock care for the rest of his life. Ethan was facing up to 20 years in prison, but instead, the judge sentenced him to 10 years of probation and some fines. His attorney had come up with this affluenza defense, meaning Ethan suffered from being too rich to know better, and the judge apparently agreed. But this would not be the end of Mr. Ethan Couch or his mom, Tanya, who was a former nurse who lost her license the year before the crash. Also that year, in 2012, Ethan ended up getting a citation for being a 15-year-old consuming and being in possession of alcohol, and he was caught in his vehicle with a naked 14-year-old who was completely passed out. So when Ethan crashed his truck the following year in 2013, he already had a prior and was on probation. So I have no idea why the hell this kid wasn't tossed up into the clink. He killed 4 people, for Pete's sake. His mom, Tanya, had also gotten in trouble in 2013 for reckless driving when she ran another driver off the road by veering into them with her vehicle. Anyway, the night of the crash, Ethan had stolen some beer. He got back into his truck, which had 7 other people in it. About an hour later, he was driving on a 2-lane road when he began careening towards that broken down SUV. Ethan lost control of his vehicle, slammed into that SUV and the people standing near it. 3 hours later, Ethan was tested as having that 2.4 blood alcohol content, along with marijuana and diazepam in his system. He was charged with 4 counts of intoxication manslaughter and 2 counts of intoxication assault. He pleaded guilty. The prosecutor sought the maximum of 20 years. but the judge ended up sentencing him to an unspecified lockdown at a rehab facility for an unspecified amount of time and 10 years of probation. While the decision of no jail time outraged lots of people who were pointing out that the only reason the judge did that was because of privilege, the judge justified his decision by saying, yeah, his parents do have the means to send him to the best treatment facilities in the country and to get him some intensive therapy, and it's all because he's still young and has a chance at bettering his life. It's also worth mentioning that it does happen a lot. Minors who are involved in these serious drunk driving incidents often are given probation instead of jail time in an effort to be aligned with the notion of giving young people a second chance through rehab instead of trying them as adults and sending them to prison. And this judge apparently had a reputation of doing just that. So fast forward 2.5 years after that accident, and what do you know? Mr. Affluenza was at it again, because as terms of his probation, he's supposed to stay away from all drugs and alcohol. There was a video of him playing beer pong and drinking that surfaced on social media, a direct violation. On December 11th, 2015, a warrant for Ethan's arrest was issued, and then his probation officer couldn't find him. A week later, both Ethan and his ride-or-die mother, Tanya, were reported missing after they failed to contact his PO. It was discovered that the both of them headed down to Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco, Mexico, and they were both picked up by the federales the same day that they were reported missing and were sent to an immigration office in Guadalajara to be deported back to the United States from Mexico. Ethan managed to make some Mexican constitutional play that ended up delaying his deportation, but his mom was sent back and arrested in the United States and charged with hindering the apprehension of a felon. Ethan was fighting to stay in Mexico, but eventually dropped the whole thing and was also flown back to the United States on January 28, 2016. His case was then moved to adult court, and on April 13th, Ethan was sentenced to 4 consecutive 180-day sentences, bringing the total to 720 days in jail, or almost 2 years. Ethan was released from jail on April 2nd, 2018. He's still on probation. He has to wear an ankle monitor, a drug patch, submit to random drug testing, and be home by 9 p.m. every night. He also has to drive with a breathalyzer in his car. So yes, he got off easy, but I'm sure the past several years have not been fun, because he was arrested again for a probation violation on January 2nd, 2020, when he tested positive for THC, but he was released the next day because they could not determine if the THC had come from illegal marijuana or from CBD oils. And where is Ethan couched today? Nobody cares. Anyway, back to the privileged kid of the day, Paul Murdaugh. If not for Paul, it's likely none of what happened in the last couple years would be happening. It was 2:30 in the morning when Paul was driving his father's 17-foot boat, along with 5 of his friends on board, and they were speeding through the darkness and the fog. Paul was loaded with booze, at least 3 times the legal limit for anyone of legal age to drink, which he was not, when he went careening into a bridge piling that sent 3 of his friends flying into the frigid waters, from which only 2 would emerge. The crippled boat ran ashore, and it was only then the 5 injured friends realized that one of them was missing. Mallory Beach, also only 19 years old at the time. She would not only be impossible to locate on that dark night, her body would not be recovered for an entire week, 5 miles away from the spot where Paul sent her to her violent, icy, watery death. Just 19 years old himself, Paul was looking to spend the entirety of his 20s and his 30s behind bars. But because he was his father's son and his grandfather's grandson, there was a time that it was thought Paul could have very well have walked away from the incident without spending 1 second behind bars, just because he was a Murdaugh. There was no currency more valuable than that family name in the low country of South Carolina. For a century, the Murdaughs held absolute and indisputable control over the area. Untouchable, they were called. That is until a spoiled, rotten, pompous, self-centered 19-year-old managed to take down the most powerful family the area had ever known. There are no words to describe how much I cannot stand these overindulged kids who behave like this. They call them loose cannons, and that's what Paul Murdaugh was. And it was only a matter of time before something tragic would happen. It was absolutely bound to happen. And I'm sorry if I seem harsh on Paul. I'll never ever say that this kid deserved to be dead today. And I don't mean to attack him personally, but it's his actions, his behaviors, and his attitude that I don't like. It seemed like everybody who knew him knew that he was quite volatile. His friends called him Timmy because he became a completely different person when he drank too much. A completely different person. If that were one of my friends, I'd be terrified to get into a vehicle with him. He would strip down to his boxers. He'd start acting crazy. He smacked his girlfriend around, spit in her face. I mean, what the hell kind of bullshit is that? How anybody could even be friends with this guy just blows my mind, but whatever. I mean, for God, like smacked her around and spit in her face. Can you imagine what Paul Murdaugh would have been like if he ever lived to grow into a full-blown adult man? If he was that barbaric at the age of 19? If that were my kid, I don't even know what I would do if I had a kid that behaved like that. I just don't even know. It doesn't sound like that there was very much discipline going on anyway. I don't know that to be a fact, but it seems like Paul was allowed to get away with whatever he wanted. And every time he messed up, his family came and saved the day. And all of that was on full display the night he killed Mallory and injured his 4 other friends. He was clearly a young man who felt entitled to do whatever he wanted to do, however he wanted to do it, every which way he wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. Like I said, it was only a matter of time. The Murdaugh family placed value on people, and they considered themselves to be of the highest worth. So when Paul called his grandfather, not his father because he clearly knew his father was as big of a screw-up as he was, Grandpa Murdaugh went straight into damage control mode. This was not about keeping Paul out of trouble. This was about keeping the Murdaugh family name out of trouble. And the only way they were going to be able to do that was to somehow make sure that Paul was not behind the wheel of that boat when it struck that piling. We know that Paul was driving the boat when he crashed and killed Mallory and injured all of his friends. They described Paul as being belligerent, and he refused to allow one of them, Connor Cook, to take over the wheel. At some points during that evening, Connor had driven the boat, but that was because Paul wanted to abuse, smack, and spit on his girlfriend. So, Paul wasn't completely unwilling to step away from the wheel, but it had to be for a good reason, like physically abusing your girlfriend. Yeah, that's a perfectly legit reason to do so, to hand controls over to somebody else, not because you're shit-faced drunk or anything like that. No, just to go and smack around your girlfriend. Both men had been drinking that evening, both Paul and Connor, but Paul was apparently way more intoxicated than Connor was. So the best thing would have been for none of them to be driving this boat. Well, I mean, the best thing would have been if one of them had stood up and smacked Paul around a few times just to straighten him out. I mean, there are a million other things that would have been better than what ultimately happened, but hindsight is 20/20. However, Connor having driven the boat when Paul needed a timeout to hit his girlfriend before he killed Mallory, gave the Murdaughs something to work with. In other words, they wanted the narrative to be that Connor was the one driving the boat, as Alec Murdaugh was reported to have told his family that it would be easier for him to get Connor out of trouble than it would be to get his own son out of trouble, which is just more Murdaugh malarkey. Plain and simple, the Murdaughs placed more value on Paul than they did on Connor. He didn't matter as much as Paul did in their eyes, which is complete garbage. The Murdaughs felt like they had a much greater distance to fall and way more to lose. They value themselves, and to them, everyone else is disposable. When you have power and when you have privilege, you see someone like Connor as less than, because he worked in construction, and because Paul was a Murdaugh, he was somehow more worthy. But I tell you, any day I'd take a hard-working, blue-collar man over some privileged little asshole of a nobody with nothing but a family legacy to ride on, who wouldn't know what to do with a hammer if his life depended on it. But as the elder Murdaugh saw it, Connor was just a lowly construction worker. Paul was one of them. So the responsibility of this boat crash needed to be assigned to Connor. The person who was driving the boat would be the one who would have to answer for Mallory's death and for the injuries to everyone else. The Murdaughs were certain that they had the power, influence, and authority to shape the narrative. They were sure that they would be able to do so with total compliance of local authorities. They were local authorities. Alec Murdaugh walked into the hospital that night where the injured kids from the boat and his son had been transported with a badge hanging from his pants. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he was somebody. Come to find, the truth was, Alec was just as much of a nobody as his son was. He shouldn't have even had that badge. His dad was the solicitor. His grandfather was the solicitor. His great-grandfather was the solicitor. For nearly 100 years, a Murdaugh held that office, but not Alec. He did not hold that office. He was a quote-unquote volunteer. And the only two reasons Alec was a volunteer is because, one, he wasn't worthy of the title, and two, the only way anyone would want him anywhere near the solicitor's office is if he would work for free. If they valued Alec Murdaugh, they'd pay him. Obviously, the man was broke. He could have used a damn paying job up in there. Why the hell would he work for free if he was so hard up for money? He worked for free because he was robbing people blind everywhere else. You see, when people work for free in a capacity such as this, much like when a politician chooses to donate their salary, it's because they were rich going in. John F. Kennedy was wealthy before he became president, so he donated his salary. I think I've heard that Donald Trump did it too, but I wasn't completely sure about that and I didn't really care enough to look it up. But they do government work. However, they don't take government money because they're rich, and they put the money towards a good cause and a tax write-off, right? But JFK didn't volunteer to be president. The voters wanted him there. Alec Murdaugh volunteered because it's the only way anyone would put up with him. They probably would have paid him to go away, if I'm being honest. But anyway, getting back to the hospital, Paul's blood alcohol content was recorded by the staff at 0.24. Several people witnessed Paul resisting being treated and examined to a point that it was required for him to be restrained. In fact, his girlfriend, her name is Morgan Dowdy, her mother was told at the hospital by the nurses that Paul was being nasty and urged her to keep her daughter away from him. And I'm not even really sure if that was a statement meant for the hospital or if that was a statement meant for life in general. Keep your daughter away from Paul. Paul was also reported as not only being nasty, but apparently thought that there was something really funny about everything that was going on. That he was there in the hospital, that all of his friends were injured and Mallory was missing and probably dead, but he was there laughing. Or he was either hitting or hitting on members of the nursing staff, seemingly unconcerned with his friends, Mallory, or the fact that he was about to be in some deep shit because the trouble he was going to be in for was going to be massive for what he had done, or at least it should have been. And that's probably because Paul knew his daddy and his granddaddy would orchestrate the cover-up for him. Why would he be worried? Why not laugh it up and try to get a date with a nurse? Paul didn't give a crap about his friends. He didn't care that Mallory was missing and probably dead. He didn't care who took the blame for driving as long as it wasn't him. Like I said, I don't like that Paul is dead or the way he was made that way, but I sure as hell didn't like him as a person in life. Though many of us have said, consider his parents, specifically his father. Alec Murdaugh went into the hospital that morning on a mission to make sure that nobody said a word to anyone about anything, especially about who was driving the boat. Alec knew damn well that his kid was the one that bus was headed straight for, so he was looking for the most convenient and irrelevant person to throw under it. Anyone would do, as long as it wasn't his boy, Paul. But from what we could see, these two, Paul and Alec, they were absolutely cut from the same cloth. Paul only cared about Paul, and Alec only cared about Alec. And because of that, there is no way in hell that I believe Alec went into that hospital that night to protect Paul. No way, not for a minute. Alec was there to protect himself and his dark secrets. He knew that all of his misdeeds were going to be on full display, front and center for the world to see once the lawsuits started coming in. And they were going to come right at him. Paul didn't have anything, and everyone was basically under the impression that Alec's branch of the Murdaugh family was wealthy. And come to find, it was all a farce. It was a house of cards that would have continued to stand if not for Paul's actions the night of the boat crash. That was the catalyst for all that was to come. Those lawsuits weren't coming for Paul, they were coming for Alec. And the truth was going to be revealed. And the man not only stood to lose everything he had, but I wouldn't be surprised if Maggie were to find out and she would slap him with some court papers of her own, divorce papers, and she would jump ship and take all she could while she could. Alec stood to lose his job, his position in the family firm, his place in the solicitor's office. He had years upon years of stealing money from clients and his own law firm that he was going to have to answer to. He was not only going to be facing losing his family, his job, his homes, his land, his money, his reputation, his good name, his family legacy, but also his freedom. The man literally had everything to lose. All because his son acted like an out-of-control asshole. In order for Alec to shotgun blast the brains out of his own son's head, you have to think that this guy must have hated him. Hated him, dude. Seriously? The fury, the rage, the resentment, the anger, the hatred, you had to. Alec Murdaugh did not give a crap about his boy. He had 2 long years to sit around and think about what his son had done. Alec was likely going to spend the better part of the rest of his life in prison for all the financial crimes that he committed. And to him, in Alec's eyes, this was all Paul's fault. That he was going to be exposed for the slimeball that he was and is. 2 long years for it to all fester. And it manifested in Alec Murdaugh blowing both Paul and Maggie away. Hatred. It had to be hatred. There's no 2 ways about it. And while Paul acted like an effing jerk, you can't help who your parents are. Look at his dad. That's who this kid had as a role model. It's no wonder he acted the way that he did. Like I said, rotten apples, rotten trees. True to Murdaugh form, Alec wanted Paul's friend Connor Cook to be the fall guy. He literally did everything from tampering with witnesses to telling the other boat passengers to remain silent or to say they don't know to any questions that they were asked by law enforcement. He went around announcing that he was representing everybody that was on the boat, and Alec made numerous attempts to try and contact Connor's parents. Not only did Alec do what Alec does, whether it be to tell, ask, order, demand, manipulate, convince, threaten, or intimidate everybody into not just saying that it was Connor who was steering the boat when it collided into the bridge piling, but he wanted them to be represented by someone described as Alec's co-conspirator, an attorney named Corey Fleming. Corey Fleming had gone to college with Alec. They were good friends, so right off the bat, it would have been a conflict of interest for a best friend of the Murdaugh family to be the attorney representing the individual that Alec wanted to take responsibility for being the one in control of the boat at the time that it crashed. What Alec is trying to do here, manipulate and control this case from both ends of this, is exactly the reason why attorneys aren't supposed to do stuff like this. And oh, by the way, this Corey Fleming character, when I said co-conspirator, he's been charged with being in cahoots with Alec and all of those financial crimes related to the money stolen from the private law firm and from clients. Fleming's law license is currently suspended, and he's under indictment for those financial crimes right along with Alec. And we already know that Alec Murdaugh is never going to live another day outside of prison, but he's still got 99 problems, and all of them are embezzlement, computer crimes, money laundering, conspiracy, among other things, where he managed to fleece approximately $9.3 million from the firm, clients, and the government. Fleming is accused of going along with all of it. So it makes sense that Alec would try to pressure Connor and his parents into allowing his BFF to represent them. More conspiracy, right? From the minute Alec learned that his son crashed his boat, he's been in this tailspin, looking for any which way to get himself out of this huge mess that his son created for him and his family. A little more than a year ago when I first covered the story, it was just a few months after that fake suicide / homicide roadside shooting / insurance scam that Alec tried to pull, I wasn't really clear just how much of a rotten scoundrel Alec Murdaugh actually was. I wasn't even sure if I believed he had killed his wife and his son. It just didn't make sense to me until you put all of these pieces together. And you see just how absolutely despicable this man was and is. It's not even funny. Literally, there is nothing about this man that I can even sit here and make light of, which I usually like to do, but I just can't. There's nothing funny about this guy or this story. It's all bad. Let's take a moment and talk about the privilege of being a Murdaugh. Let's say, for example, let's take a hypothetical situation, and let's think about it. Say that any one of us was out drinking and partying with some of our friends. And of our friends, we are known to be the biggest asshole of them all. And when we're drunk, nobody can tell us anything. We're drinking and doing shots and getting totally smashed. And then we all get into a vehicle. And we are the ones who are behind the wheel because we're belligerent when we're drunk. And all the while, we're arguing when we're driving and not watching where we're going. And suddenly, we wrap our car around a light pole or a tree. Chances are, someone is going to end up dead. And ironically, more often than not, it's not the driver. So then it gets determined that it was you or me behind the wheel of this vehicle the time we crashed. We get taken to the hospital. They draw our blood and find that our blood alcohol content was 2.4, 3 times the legal limit in most states, I believe. Somebody is dead. There is no way in hell any one of us listening to this right now, and myself included, that we are going to walk out of that hospital and go home. As soon as we are discharged, our asses are getting booked into the county jail. And we're going to be sitting there for a long time. It's highly unlikely that we're going to get bailed out anytime soon, if at all, right? If we can afford it. And depending on the laws of your state, you can get up to 20 years in prison. And if you already have a DUI and you go and kill somebody when drunk driving again, you're looking at spending the rest of your life in prison potentially. That is what would happen to any one of us. But in the Low Country, if you're a Murdaugh, then the rules don't apply to you. Well, at least they used to not apply to you. Now, if you're a Murdaugh, the Low Country is busy trying to catch up with you. In the time prior to the boat crash, and in the days, weeks, and months following, there was a real growing concern when it came to the families of the kids on that boat with Paul that night, especially for the family of Mallory Beach, that Paul was going to skate free purely because of the prominence of his family. Like I said, if it were any one of us, we would be arrested after being treated in the hospital. We may have even been handcuffed to the bed with an officer standing by to transport us to the county jail. When Alec showed up, he announced that he was representing Paul, which is really the thing we're told to do over and over again, right? Lawyer up. But because we're talking about Alec and Paul, it just feels wrong. And that's just because we know that the plan is to control the narrative and shift the blame. So Paul gets to drive a boat with a .24 blood alcohol content, crash into a bridge, injure 5, and kill 1, yet he gets to go home to the comfort of his mommy and daddy, while the rest of the community is spending the next 6 days desperately searching for Mallory, knowing damn well that they're not looking for an alive Mallory, but rather her body. And you know the condition that it is going to be in when they do find her in the water after 6 days. And while Paul is at home being comforted by his family, Mallory's family gets to suffer the anguish of losing her and not knowing her fate for those 6 days. It wouldn't be for another 2 months that Paul would be charged with a trio of felonies: driving a water vehicle while under the influence resulting in a death, and 2 counts of boating under the influence resulting in great bodily injury. But Paul would never get served an arrest warrant at his home or wherever he goes from day to day. He would never get handcuffed. He would never be placed into the back of a squad car or booked into the county jail, all of which should have happened right away, the night of the crash. Paul should have never been able to go home after that accident. He needed to go to jail, get his ass before a judge, and have his bail set. His official mugshot was even taken outside the courtroom while he was wearing a dress shirt instead of a county-issued orange jumpsuit. Even celebrities get the orange jumpsuit treatment, but not Paul Murdaugh. In addition to that, anyone out on bail for the kinds of charges that Paul was facing would be ordered by the judge to wear an alcohol ankle monitor, but not Paul Murdaugh. The prosecution asked for it, but the judge denied it. And it really seems terribly irresponsible to not place an alcohol monitor on this kid who was underage drinking with a very high blood alcohol content, facing all of these felonies, and he killed somebody. Clearly, he is a danger to society. But who knew what was to come, right? Like I said, rotten apples and rotten trees. Who could have ever foreseen just how much of a danger and a menace that his father would eventually become? So not only did Paul get to go home to mommy and daddy and just wait around for whatever was going to happen, COVID came around and prolonged everything even more. But prior to that, Paul continued to drink and party as all these activities continued to be posted up on social media pretty much on a regular basis. So yeah, with no ankle monitor, Paul continued to drink. Luckily, he didn't kill anybody else in the time that he was waiting to face charges for the person that he did kill. So, full disclosure, I have no real idea the actual breadth and depth of Alec Murdaugh's financial transgressions. And transgression doesn't even seem to do justice to what this man did. Alec Murdaugh is like a supervillain with a law license. He's like this character in a TV show that you just hate, like a dastardly scoundrel. I don't even really know for how long he's been ripping everyone off, and everywhere he had been working too. But you know what, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't very long after he obtained his law license and established himself as a partner at the family firm. But I imagine that between Alec and his siblings, He didn't just become the black sheep of the family out of nowhere. He had probably long identified as such way back when he was growing up, and then when he got to be the age that Paul was, and into college and law school, and after he began practicing law. Obtaining all of those degrees and licenses didn't change the way Alec operated. And his family prominence, the name, the Murdaugh Dynasty, it all enabled Alec for his entire life to be the person that he was. And he was passing that on to his son, possibly even both of them, but that remains to be seen. So for years, Alec had been living a life of greed and self-indulgence, and he raised his kids that way too. I don't know how much or how little Maggie was in the know, but because they were such a prominent family, it wasn't like Alec was pulling millions of dollars out of his ass with no explanation from where it came. He came from a wealthy family, so people just assumed that he had wealth, never thinking that he was lying, cheating, and stealing to get it. Alec had everything at his disposal, everything that he needed to carry out his misdeeds against the most vulnerable of individuals. Clients who were suffering, injured, or lost loved ones. He would win these huge personal injury lawsuits for these people who often barely had 2 nickels to rub together. He would take on these large corporations, sue the pants off them, win these huge settlements, pay his clients whatever he saw fit, and then lined his own pockets with the rest. Alec was tricky about it, and you can imagine the clients were just glad to win something for their pain and suffering, right? And we know in the case of the Murdaugh housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, her boys got nothing, while at the same time, Alec got more than $4 million. This man literally sued himself and then awarded himself the settlement, and all it cost him was one housekeeper's life. What a bargain. That's the kind of man that we're dealing with here. Is it even any wonder that Paul was laughing and smiling at the sight of the boat crash and acting like a jackass at the hospital? With a dad like that, the answer is no. So Alec's little money bilking scheme carried on, rampant and unhindered for years. He operated under the protection of the Murdaugh name. For a long time, Alec was untouchable. And this was all fine and dandy until it wasn't. A little more than 10 years before that boat crash, the United States found itself thrust into a recession that caused millions of people to lose their homes and their jobs. Unless you had a safety net or a recession-proof job, many people found themselves upside down in their mortgages. They were getting foreclosed on their houses that they owed tens of thousands of dollars more than what the property was actually worth. And I'm sure, knowing what we know about Alec Murdaugh, he would have been one to suffer too. He had properties, and his net worth was probably sinking very quickly. So I would not be at all surprised that it was during the recession when Alec really began to escalate his financial crimes. I don't know that to be a fact, but it seems that it would make sense. And once the world and the United States were all back on stable ground, Alec probably kept going. And then the boat crash happened. And then there was a little thing known as COVID that wreaked havoc across the entire globe. And while that may have caused Paul's criminal case to drag on for much longer than it would have if not for COVID, it also likely had a major impact on Alec's house of cards that was growing increasingly more fragile in the wake of the boat crash and Mallory's death. COVID caused everything to come to a screeching halt, and it was probably starting to feel like Mallory was never going to get justice. But you know what COVID also probably did to Alec? It likely choked off his cash flow. It wasn't just the criminal courts that were going to be on indefinite lockdown. It was the civil stuff too. That meant no work was happening. There was probably not a whole lot of money coming in, at least not in the way that they were used to. And that means no money to embezzle. Perhaps under normal circumstances, the Murdaughs would have been able to make it through COVID without too much of a struggle. But with that pesky son of his and those pesky felony charges, driving under the influence causing a death and great bodily injury, they were going into financial ruin. And COVID only made it worse. On top of that, all the years of Alec's financial chicanery would most certainly come to light. The thing was, Mallory's death put a chink in the Murdaugh family armor, finally. Nobody who Alec Murdaugh wronged mattered until then. There was just no getting around what Paul did. Unlike what happened to Miss Gloria Satterfield, her death was just accidental looking enough for it to be overlooked. It's like I said in the beginning, the Murdaughs were getting away with everything until they harmed someone whose family and loved ones were not simply going to walk away or accept what Alec was telling them. Someone finally had the power, the knowledge, the means, and the resources to stand up to the Murdaugh machine. And come hell or high water, they were not going to back down. When criminal charges weren't filed, Mallory's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit. COVID may have sidetracked the system for a while, but it wasn't going to be forever. It was only a matter of time. The day Alec Murdaugh was going to have to face the music in court to answer to the charges, to show his finances, that day was looming. And he knew that he and Paul were going to go from matching tuxedos to matching jailhouse uniforms with the word inmate emblazoned on the back. That day was looming. And just before Alec was about to have that day in court, he decided the answer to his problems was to set both his son and his wife up at the Moselle hunting property. He lured them out there the night of June 7th, 2021, and shot them both to death. It's very difficult to understand how a seemingly loving husband and father would reach the conclusion that that was the best possible scenario. But if that father is a narcissistic coward who only cares about himself, then yeah, it's not that much of a stretch. A year ago, I wasn't sure if it was him or not. But since then, it's been proven, I believe beyond any doubt, that yeah, he actually did that. Alec Murdaugh blew his son and his wife's brains all out to save his own ass. And there is no way, absolutely no way, that I would believe that that roadside suicide setup was for the good of his surviving son, Buster. What Alec did on that road that night is exactly what Alec does, which is looking for drastic ways to wiggle his way out of trouble. Every single thing Alec did, from the night he waddled into that hospital with that stupid crackerjack badge on his hip, to the night that he tried to fake shoot himself in the head, all of it was for the benefit of Alec and nobody else. There is no way Alec murdered Paul and Maggie and then turned around to sacrifice himself in order for Buster to be able to collect $10 million in life insurance so he would be able to carry on the family legacy with whatever semblance of pride that there was left to be had. No way. You will never ever get me to believe that that man was the fall on the sword type of guy. There is not a single altruistic fiber in that man's being. He would throw everybody on the sword before he'd go anywhere near it. And the only reason that this man would go near it would be to pick it up and to continue stabbing everybody else in the back with it. Alec Murdaugh is exactly where he deserves to be. His son and his wife, I wish that they were still here. I wish Paul was here to face the music for what he did to Mallory, his friends, and their families. He was still a very young man. With the right guidance, he could have redeemed himself. He could have turned this tragedy into a purpose. He would have still had a very strong family support system around him. I absolutely believe he could have led a decent life if his father hadn't executed him. And Maggie, she absolutely deserves to be here too. She had already started distancing herself from Alec. She was living at their Family Beach property, right? She could have retained herself a decent attorney, gotten herself as far away as possible from her family that was on the verge of collapse, taken her boys, protected them from their father's mess, worked on getting both of them on the right track to successful adult lives, divorced Alex, taken whatever she could have gotten. Her boys would have been there for her, and she would have been there for them. And she could have started her life, the life that she was meant to have, all over again with her sons. And I'm assuming here that she didn't have a hand in anything illegal that Alec was doing. Yeah, and as a bonus, Maggie could have turned on Alec, cooperated with authorities investigating him, and helped send him off to prison, probably for the rest of his life. And if we're ever wondering why Maggie had to die too, all of this I just laid out, Maggie's hypothetical escape plan, could have very well been the reason why. In Alec's eyes, Maggie was likely a liability, just like Paul. And it really saddens me, the fact that he did that to them. He had no right. And like he said on that body cam recording, I did him so bad. Yeah, he did. I don't know about all of you, but I was absolutely fascinated with the cell phone evidence that came out at Alec's trial. They were literally able to track every single step of the way as Paul and Maggie made their ways towards their violent deaths. I've heard the timeline broken down timestamp by timestamp, but I wanted us to get a real solid grasp on just how little time there was between when we believe Paul and Maggie were killed to the time Alec called 911 to report what he had done. And I had seen a timeline that started off towards the beginning of the day, how the morning started. And even earlier in that day, the day that Paul and Maggie were murdered, it just kind of goes to show the mundaneness of the lives of these people. But at the same time, you see the lifestyle that they're accustomed to as well. Earlier that day, around 12 p.m., Alec left the Moselle property to go to his law firm. We know now that when he got there, he was confronted about the missing money that very afternoon. And this is when Alec decided Paul and Maggie needed to die. He probably thought about it before, but I think that this whole thing being confronted solidified it for him. Alec needed them to die in order to not only get rid of the problems that Paul caused him and all the problems Maggie was going to cause him, he needed to do something drastic to detract from the investigation into his financial malfeasance. And all of it came about because of Paul. When Mallory Beach's family filed a civil lawsuit against the Murdaughs, Alec was going to have to cough up all of his financial information. And what this did was bring about the investigation into the embezzlement that he had been involved in for as many as 10 years, if not more by then. And that is exactly what happened. The confrontation at Alec's law offices happened 3 days before the hearing for the civil case that was scheduled involving Paul and the boat crash. And it is highly probable that if that hearing happened as planned, that all of Alec's dirty little secrets were going to be put on full display for the world to see. He was going to be exposed, and Alec knew that he would be going to jail likely for the rest of his life. That's how vast the nature of his crimes amounted to. It's no coincidence that Alec was confronted by his law partners on the exact same day that Paul and Maggie were murdered. And for the time being, the plan worked. The civil lawsuit hearing never happened. The criminal charges against Paul were subsequently dropped, and the law firm put the brakes on the investigation into the embezzlement that they suspected Alec of committing. And in fact, the law firm were on pace to letting the whole thing go for the sake of their colleague who had just lost his beloved son and the love of his life. After all, they could never go after a man over a pew-fetty hundreds of thousands of dollars who was going through such a tragedy. So yeah, Alec's murder plan was kind of working. So the afternoon of the murders, through the various text message communications, it was found that the Murdaughs had an employee tend to the dogs and chickens that they had on the Moselle property. they had their housekeeper, Blanca, preparing dinner for Alec, Maggie, and Paul. She had sent Maggie a text telling her that she had left dinner on the stove. Maggie had a doctor's appointment that afternoon and a foot massage. She had texted her sister that Alec wanted her to come to the Moselle property because his dad was admitted to the hospital with pneumonia. Alec left his law firm at 6:24 p.m. that afternoon. Paul texted Maggie a little before 6:30 asking what Blanca had made them for dinner, and she told him fried steak and macaroni and cheese. Paul called his dad at 6:40, and the two of them spoke for 2 minutes. Alec arrived at Moselle 2 minutes later. A minute after that, Alec called Maggie, and that call lasted about a minute and a half. Paul arrived at Moselle about 20 minutes after his dad. He told his dad that his mom was getting a foot massage, so Alec texted Maggie at 7:05 and told her to call him when she's done. 2 minutes later, Maggie started driving towards Moselle. She made several phone calls along the way, and there was some discussion in a group text about Alec's father being in the hospital and close to death. From 7:25 that evening for more than an hour, both Paul and Maggie's phones were constantly being used to make calls and text messages. Paul's phone also recorded steps and his location where he was at on the Moselle property. Alec was also recording steps that he was taking and movements around the property as well, but not as much as Paul at this point. Just before 8 p.m., Paul was down by the dog kennels, and both his phone and Alec's phone were recording close to the same number of steps being taken as they were moving between the main house and the kennels. Paul was busy sending various Snapchats during this time. At 8:09, Alec's phone stopped moving and would remain still for almost the next hour. Alec initially told investigators that he was asleep on the couch in the main house at that time. At 8:17, Maggie's phone started recording steps. By 8:38, Paul's phone placed him back at the dog kennels. 2 minutes later, he called his friend Rogan to tell him that there was something wrong with his dog's tail. That dog was being kenneled at the Moselle property because Rogan lived at a place where he couldn't have the dog. 4 minutes after that call, Paul attempted to FaceTime Rogan in order to show him the dog's tail, but he wasn't getting good enough service. Just seconds after that FaceTime attempt, Paul recorded 2 videos of the dog in order to send them to Rogan so he could see the injured tail. This was approximately 8:44 p.m. Remember, Alec's phone is completely still. He said he was asleep. At 8:44 p.m., when the video of the dog was taken by Paul, all 3 voices of the people present at the Moselle property were captured on the video: Paul's, Maggie's, and Alec's. And that was the aha moment of the trial, when all of us learned this very tantalizing bit of information for the first time. Alec Murdaugh wasn't asleep in the house. His phone was asleep in the house, maybe, but he sure wasn't. He was right there, mere minutes before his son's phone and his wife's phone locked for the very last time. Paul continued to text for approximately another 5 minutes before the activity on his phone ended forever. He never sent that video to Rogan, who was on the other end of that conversation waiting for it, because he was worried about the injured tail. He never got the video, that video where we all heard Alec's voice. So we can only assume that Alec was near the kennels, lurking in the dark, with a shotgun getting ready to kill his son. Paul's phone locked at 8:49 p.m. 25 seconds later, Maggie's phone locked. And this is the time that it is believed that Alec shot Paul to death. Just seconds after Maggie's phone locked, Paul's phone received a message from Rogan asking for a picture of the tail so he could send it to a friend who worked as a veterinarian. But that message was never read. Neither one of their phones, Paul's or Maggie's, were used or unlocked ever again after 8:50 p.m. And this is the time it was believed that both Maggie and Paul were then dead. Remember, Paul took that video which captured the sound of Alec's voice just 4 to 5 minutes before all activity on Paul's phone came to a dead stop. Both he and Maggie were very, very busy on their phones all afternoon and evening, and we know that Paul's phone stopped when he was in the middle of somewhat of an important exchange with his friend Rogan. The only reason either one of them would suddenly stop engaging with their phones was because they stopped engaging in life. And therein lies the problem that Alec Murdaugh would encounter some months later when analysts were finally able to break into Paul's phone. The video that exposed him as a massive liar. Everybody already knew that, but this was the massive lie that he told that was meant to be his alibi. It was his cover story. He told police that night he was never down at the kennels. That video that his son took not only proved that he was lying, but it placed him exactly at the scene of the murders less than 5 minutes before Paul used his phone for the very last time. And what that did was it made every single thing that Alex said surrounding the time of the video before and after a lie. He would later go on to say that he lied because he didn't trust the police. Convenient, right? Two of the people who Alec claimed for many years to have loved and cherished had just been violently shot and killed, and his first instinct is to lie to police. No reasonable person would do anything like that to mislead police or hinder the investigation by not claiming to have been at the scene of a double murder, because a reasonable person would want the police to know as much as possible from a witness who was at the dog kennels minutes before Paul and Maggie were murdered. After Alec shot Paul, he quickly picked up a different weapon, an AR-style rifle, and shot Maggie as she was headed down towards the kennel from where she was when she heard the gunshots. And then when she saw Alec with the gun pointed at her, it seems that she attempted to retreat, but we know how her story ended. And as you know, both Paul and Maggie were shot multiple times, including a shot to each of their heads. So based on the remainder of the cell phone evidence, we can infer what Alec did next. His voice was captured on Paul's video, which was taken from 8:44 to 8:45 p.m. 17 minutes later, at 9:02 p.m., after being completely still for the last 53 minutes, Alec's phone suddenly comes back to life. And the phone began recording Alec's steps again, but this time, he's moving at a noticeably more rapid pace. 2 minutes later, Alec placed a call to Maggie's phone, a call, of course, that goes unanswered because Maggie has been shot to death by this time. It's probably worth mentioning that right now, for whatever reason, this call, along with several other calls that Alec made from his phone as the evening went on, were deleted from his log. Some calls were deleted, some calls weren't. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for it. It may have been just Alec's attempt to try to confuse the whole situation. But anyway, 4 minutes later, Alec's vehicle, which they all have the data about too, just like his phone, because it recorded everything that was happening because it was equipped with OnStar. So 4 minutes after he had called Maggie's phone, his vehicle passed by the place where her phone would be found the next day. The implication being that whomever it was that shot and killed Paul and Maggie for whatever reason took her phone with them and then ditched it as they drove this route away from the Moselle property. At the same time that Alec made this call, Maggie's phone changed orientation, which means that somebody picked it up. There are two things that can be inferred from Maggie's phone being ditched like this, and both of them look circumstantially bad for Alec. One, his vehicle was driving past the exact location where Maggie's phone was found at the time it was ditched. And two, I think the reason why Alec deleted the call from his phone log is because 2 minutes before Alec drove past the location of Maggie's phone, he tried calling her phone a second time, receiving no answer. I think he suddenly realized that the locations of both his phone and Maggie's phone would be tracked, and it would be revealed that both phones would be seen traveling in the same direction in the same location at the same time when he made that second phone call. So he quickly threw the phone out the window, and when he did, he deleted this call from his log, thinking that it would magically make all records of it disappear too. You would think an attorney in this century would know better, but it just goes to show, no matter how smart you think you are, when you do murder, you turn stupid. The smartest person in the world becomes a complete idiot the moment they start murder plotting. Time and time and time again, we see these people start thinking about murder. And they think they've got it all figured out. But just the fact that they even think that just proves that they're a dumbass, especially in this day and age. The thing is, Alec Murdaugh was pinning his little man hopes on things going his way because of his family name, his prominence, and the police just rolling over for him like they always have in the past. Alec's problem was his overblown ego got in the way of his ability to see that his family name simply wasn't as hot of a commodity as it used to be. And it all goes back to Mallory Beach. The Murdaughs were finally being held accountable and being made to answer to killing someone that unfortunately mattered a little bit more to the community than Stephen Smith and Gloria Satterfield. So, getting back to the minutes following Paul and Maggie's murder, 5 minutes after Alec's phone came to life, after 2 calls to Maggie and 1 call to his dad, Alec's vehicle left the Moselle property and drove in the direction of Alameda, and this, of course, was to create his alibi, but Alec calls it visiting his mom, an elderly woman with dementia, after 9 o'clock at night, because that's the best time to visit our elderly, ailing parents, apparently. And Alec is rushing towards Alameda. 2 minutes after trying to call his dead wife for a second time, Alec sent a text to his dead wife, telling her that he was going to check on M, be right back. But Maggie never reads the text because she's dead. Smartest guy in the Low Country, right? Never mind the fact that Alec's mom is probably asleep, which she was, and even if she wasn't, she may or may not be all that responsive to his visit, and never mind the fact that his mom has an evening caregiver that Alec could have very easily called or sent a text to find out how she was doing, and never mind the fact that the whole group conversation throughout the day and evening was about Alec's father having taken a turn for the worse and would go on to pass away just 3 days after Paul and Maggie. But no, visiting his mom was the priority on this night, apparently. Randolph Murdaugh, Alec's father, had been admitted to the hospital. And while it would have made sense for Alec to have gone to see him, there would probably just be too many more people to try and have to manipulate. In visiting his mom, the only person he would have to manipulate would be his mother's caregiver, and her name was Shelley Smith. And we know that in visiting his mom, he only spent 18 minutes there, yet he tried to get the caregiver to say that he was there for 45 minutes, if anyone ever asks. But Shelley Smith would end up testifying to the truth and the real amount of time that Alec was visiting his mother, and that he tried implicating her into providing a false alibi. Oh yeah, and she also confirmed that Alec's mom was sleeping the whole time that he was there. So, getting back to Alec's drive away from Moselle. All of a sudden, Alec Murdaugh is Mr. Chatty Cathy. He tried calling Maggie twice. He tried calling his dad. He tried calling Buster. He tried calling his friend and fellow attorney Chris Wilson, who didn't answer but returned his call. That call lasted 2 minutes. Then Alec called his older brother, John Marvin. That call lasted 1 minute and 46 seconds. And that was a call that was deleted from Alec's log as well. Then Chris Wilson called Alec back. They talked for 3 minutes until Alec told him he was arriving at his mom's and that he would call him back. The time now was 9:22 p.m., 15 minutes after Alec's vehicle left the Moselle property. It is interesting to note that Alec did not pull all the way up into his mother's driveway and close to her house. Instead, he pulled halfway in, a distance away. And he probably did this to prevent anyone from being able to pinpoint the time of his arrival, or perhaps to avoid being captured on any video surveillance that might have been outside his mother's house, trained on the driveway or anything like that. Smartest guy in the low country, right? Once again, your car is equipped with OnStar, you dummy. Oh, and OnStar, let it be known that Alec was driving close to 74 miles or 119 kilometers per hour while traveling to his mother's house, faster than Alec normally drove. So now that Mr. Smarty Pants has established himself this alibi, he's got to get himself back to the Moselle property for the big reveal and one of his many performances. I'm sure he practiced making this 911 call in front of the bathroom mirror a few times. And of course, that call that he would make would be all about him. Okay, dreamers, I'm going to go ahead and pause the story here and split this up into 2 parts so I can get this recorded and uploaded for you in good time. Like I said, I just got back from California yesterday. Me and my daughter had a very nice time as always. But anyway, when we come back for part 2, we will pick the story back up with Alec, that silly, pale-looking potato, and his attempts to continue to manipulate people, specifically Paul's friend Rogan Gibson. Remember, Rogan is the one who was last to be in communication with Paul right before Alec gunned him down. Alec seemed anxious to try and get a hold of Rogan, and we're going to try and explore the reasons why. Why would a father and a husband who discovered his wife and son murdered try to call his dead son's friend? And then after that, we will continue to take a look at the rest of his low country mess that Alec Murdaugh has created. I want to thank you for listening. The second part of this will be available as soon as I'm done writing and recording it the next couple of days. And until then, try not to plan or carry out any murders. And as always, sweet dreams.